Hello, my name is Alexander Poshak, and for my final project, I will be discussing racial discourses and colorblind racism that impacted my dad's family. What are racial discourses? Racial discourses is language that represents potentially harmful sentiment toward racial groups. It is also a tool for maintaining status quo racial structures. I found that there are 7 different racial discourses, and they are as follows: individualizing racism. That is racism that is used by individual persons that are intended to cause harm to other people. It reinforces the broad assumption that racism stops with a singular person. It is falsely believed that punishing, shaming, and re-educating that person solves the racist behavior. There is falsely equating incomparable acts, which loosely means a word, action, or ideology that isn't a big deal to the group expressing these thoughts over an ethnic or racial group, that the same thoughts would actually cause pain to that group. So, for example, we hear the word illegal alien thrown around in the news, and to most white folk, that word is no big deal, but to the migrants that word describes, it does cause some pain. There's diverting from race, which is claiming other factors other than race influences decisions. There's portraying government as overreaching, which claims that government-based programs developed to help minorities are an overreach of power. There is prioritizing intent over impact. This disclosure focuses on ulterior motive rather than motive than what it is intended for. For example, certain firms could just justify not hiring minorities and make an excuse is like, oh, that person has tattoos and we don't want to hire you for that reason, when in reality they just don't want to hire that ethnic or racial group. There's coded language, which are interchangeable and non-eyebrow raising words that suggest a conclusion that are quite opposite from its intention. And there is silencing history, which is leaving out, oversighting, and ignoring important non-white historical moments, such as slavery revolts in the antebellum South. Okay, so what is colorblind racism? Colorblind racism is the belief that belonging to a racial group doesn't matter when managing diversity and intergroup relations. There are 4 different frames to colorblind racism. They go as follows. There is abstract liberalism, which is the use of ideas connected with political and economic freedoms in a broad context that falsely claim that the ideologies associated with these freedoms are in fact used in an anti-racist way. There is naturalization, which is a frame that white folks use to suggest and reinforce that actions that racial groups directly and indirectly perform are natural and correlate with particular racial groups correlate with particular racial groups. I apologize. So I don't want to say anything bad, but it's just saying, like, certain stereotypes are natural to certain ethnic and racial groups. There is cultural racism, which is a frame that depends on ethnic, racial, and cultural stereotypes. So instead of saying, stereotypes are natural, this type of frame ties in those stereotypes with a specific group. There's also minimalization of racism, which is a frame that proposes downplaying, watering down, and degradation of the role and presence of racism that holds back non-white folks' chances of success. For example, if someone says, oh, racism isn't that bad today, which in reality it is, it's still bad, and this other person will say, oh, it's not the 1960s, it was way worse. I kind of just say, okay, well, because it's racist today, it's okay because it used to be more racist. All right, so how did colorblind racism and racial discourses impact my dad? So, first, let me just tell a short story. Um, so, there was a cultural type of racism that said that, people from Eastern Europe were good workers. So, my dad being the Polish boy he is, of course he found a job. So this one time he was working, and he was just doing a better job and staying more productive than his old stock American worker co-workers. So in retaliation, they shoved him in a dirty clothes hamper full of soiled clothing. He actually got undergarments shoved into his mouth, which is particularly revolting. And meanwhile, and simultaneously, his face got smothered, and his coworkers were choking on him. To add insult to injury, his coworkers weren't written up, his coworkers weren't scolded, nor were they fired for practically endangering his life and committing ethnical violence towards him. All right, so that being said, obviously my dad, was experiencing individualized racism because he was the Eastern European person, not the old stock American. I kind of touched on it before, but cultural racism because he fit that stereotype and he was hired on. And that may sound like, oh, he got a job, but this type of stereotype actually didn't help him when it came to intersectionality, and that will be covered upon a little bit later. There's also falsely equating incomparable acts. So, because this racism happened, no one particularly thought, these actions, these things happened to him because he was Polish, and that also kind of goes hand in hand with minimalization of racism. Yes, all this stuff happened to him, but upper management just kind of scoffed it off and didn't really think anything about it. My dad also experienced coded language, from the old stock Americans. If people realized he was Polish, they would hush their tones and talk behind his back. They would actually go as far to ignore him as well, just completely pretend that he didn't exist. And there was also a silencing of history. This didn't really pertain to my dad, but this type of Polish mentality, kind of helped him when he moved to the south side of Youngstown. But you know, traditionally, Polish people are more tolerant, and because of this, we don't really have any problems with interacting with people who are different than us. And actually, this one Polish Jew, he named Leonard Chess. His name was Americanized. His last name was more like Chesh. But he approached black blues artists like Muddy Waters, Howling Wolf, and Etta James, and put their music on the mainstream radio. All right, so like I said earlier, my dad's family, encountered institutional racism, where he was they Polish, boys and Eastern Europeans were expected to work in sweaty shops for the rest of their lives. There's that intersectionality also, where um, Polish people were and other Eastern European peoples were expected to stay in one part of town and kept kind of lower on the social totem pole, and other inequalities which kind of worked out, because my dad was friends with Irish, Puerto Rican, and black kids, people kind of saw that as a double whammy and really treated him poorly and kind of treated him like a leper. But that didn't really bother him because he was just very tolerable. And yeah, so here are my citations that I used for my definitions and my little history lesson with Leonard Chess. So thank you. Have a good day.